Using urine as mouthwash and teeth whitener. Before toothpaste, before mouthwash, before anyone thought to rub a minty leaf across their teeth and call it a day, the ancient Romans had a solution, and that solution was urine. Not their own, ideally. Collected urine, left to ferment in clay vessels on street corners, purchased by the jug and swished around the mouth like it was the finest thing available. And the genuinely unsettling part is that it worked. Urine contains ammonia, a compound that breaks down stains and kills bacteria well enough that the practice persisted for centuries across multiple cultures. Roman poet Catullus even mocked a man for having suspiciously white teeth, implying the brightness itself was proof of how much urine he was consuming. Portuguese urine was reportedly considered the most potent and was allegedly exported to Rome in sealed amphorae for the premium dental care market, though the primary sources for this specific trade detail are debated by historians. What is well documented is that the Roman Emperor Vespasian saw the demand for collected urine as a taxable commercial industry and levied a fee on its collection and sale, prompting the famous phrase, pecunia non olet, money doesn't smell. The practice wasn't confined to Rome either. Early modern European medical texts into the 17th century continued recommending urine-based rinses as legitimate dental advice from licensed physicians. The ammonia did the work. The smell was simply the price. Communal sponge on a stick. Roman public toilets, called foracae, were some of the most advanced sanitation infrastructure the ancient world had ever produced, and they were also deeply, profoundly communal, in a way that modern sensibilities find difficult to process. These were long stone benches with evenly spaced holes cut into them, running water beneath to carry waste away, and no dividers, no stalls, no privacy of any kind. Dozens of people sat side by side conducting their business while chatting, conducting transactions, and passing time together, because this was simply what going to the toilet meant. The cleaning implement shared between all of them was a xylospongium, a sea sponge fixed to a wooden or terracotta stick, sitting in a communal bucket of salt water or vinegar between uses. That was the sanitation protocol. Some of the larger latrines, including those excavated near the Palatine Hill, could seat 50 to 80 people simultaneously. Archaeologists have found that the drainage systems beneath these structures frequently suffered from pressure issues that pushed waste back up through the holes, meaning the environment was considerably worse than the gleaming marble implied. A parasitological study of Roman-era coprolites, preserved fecal matter, found evidence that intestinal parasites actually spread more widely in Roman urban populations than in pre-Roman ones, despite the infrastructure investment. The Romans built the pipes, they just shared the sponge. Bloodletting as universal medical treatment. For approximately 2,000 years, the most common medical procedure performed by trained physicians across the Western world was draining blood from sick patients, and it was applied to nearly every condition imaginable. Fevers, infections, broken bones, depression, headaches, and childbirth complications were all treated with bloodletting, based on the humoral theory developed by Hippocrates and later codified by the Roman physician Galen. The theory held that the body contained four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, and that illness resulted from imbalances between them. Too much blood was almost always the diagnosis. Barber surgeons addressed this with lancets, with scarification, and with leeches, sometimes removing a pint or more of blood in a single session from patients who were already dangerously weakened. The commercial demand for leeches reached extraordinary levels. France alone was importing approximately 42 million leeches per year at the peak of the practice in the 1830s, stripping local wetlands of their populations and creating international leech trade routes. The most famous casualty of the practice was almost certainly George Washington, who in December 1799 developed a severe throat infection and was treated by his physicians with repeated bloodletting over a single day, reportedly losing close to 40% of his total blood volume before dying, though historians debate whether the infection or the treatment killed him faster. It was the French physician Pierre Louis who began dismantling the practice in the late 1820s by applying statistical analysis to patient outcomes and finding, with clinical detachment, that bled patients died at higher rates than those left alone, throwing waste out of windows. For much of the medieval and early modern period in European cities, the standard domestic waste disposal system was a chamber pot and an open window. Households collected their waste overnight in ceramic pots, and in the morning, simply opened the shutters and hurled the contents into the street below, ideally after shouting a warning to pedestrians. In Edinburgh's Old Town, this warning cry was Gardez-l'eau, derived from the French garde l'eau, watch out for the water, a phrase so commonly heard that it eventually filtered into English slang and, through a disputed but widely repeated etymological chain, may have contributed to the word loo as a term for the toilet. Edinburgh earned the nickname Auld Reekie, Old Smoky, from the perpetual stench rising from its streets, which functioned as open sewers for much of the year. Paris was no cleaner. The River Seine served simultaneously as the city's primary water source and its main waste dump, a situation that persisted well into the modern era and contributed to repeated cholera outbreaks. In this environment, rats thrived, and the conditions that allowed the Black Death to devastate European populations were significantly amplified by the waste-saturated streets of medieval cities. Someone had to clean it eventually, and that job fell to gong farmers, men employed specifically to empty cesspits and privies, permitted to work only at night, legally required to live outside city walls, and paid several times the wage of an ordinary laborer precisely because the work was so catastrophically unpleasant. Corpse medicine. Between approximately the 15th and 18th centuries, consuming human remains was not a fringe taboo in Europe. It was mainstream medicine, endorsed by trained physicians, sold in apothecaries, and consumed by royalty. The practice centered on a substance called mummia, originally derived from Egyptian mummies, but eventually extended to any processed human tissue. Ground human skull mixed into wine or chocolate was prescribed for epilepsy and headaches. Human fat, rendered from the bodies of executed criminals, was rubbed onto arthritic joints, wounds, and bruises. In Germany and several other European countries, executioners were permitted to sell the fat of those they executed as a secondary commercial income, making the scaffold a place of multiple transactions. Warm blood, ideally fresh from an executed criminal, was consumed by crowds who pressed toward public executions, specifically to catch it in cups, a treatment considered effective for epilepsy. King Charles II of England reportedly consumed what were called the King's Drops, a preparation containing distilled human skull, as a daily tonic, a detail documented by scholar Richard Sugg in his academic study of the practice. The supply of Egyptian mummies was finite, and as it dwindled and as humoral medicine began to be replaced by more empirical approaches through the 18th century, corpse medicine faded, not immediately, and not because it scandalized people, but simply because the theoretical framework that justified it gradually collapsed. Lead in absolutely everything. The Romans' relationship with lead was one of history's most consequential unrecognized disasters. They used it in their plumbing. The word plumber comes directly from plumbum, the Latin word for lead, in their cooking vessels, their storage amphorae, their cosmetics, their paint, and most critically in their food and wine. Defrutum, a popular Roman condiment made by boiling down grape juice into a thick syrup, was prepared in lead pots, causing lead acetate to leach into the mixture during cooking. Lead acetate tastes sweet, which made it desirable as an additive and a preservative, and Roman cookbooks, including the collection attributed to Apicius, reference its use extensively. The symptoms of chronic lead poisoning, cognitive decline, irritability, fatigue, reproductive failure, erratic behavior, are strikingly well represented in the historical record of the Roman ruling class, and historian Jerome Neriagu proposed in a 1983 paper that widespread lead poisoning among the Roman aristocracy may have contributed to the empire's decline, a theory that remains debated but has not been dismissed. The problem wasn't confined to Rome. Elizabethan women achieved the fashionable pale complexion of the era using Venetian ceruse, a white lead-based cosmetic applied thickly across the face and neck, which caused skin damage, hair loss, and slow poisoning over years of use. Queen Elizabeth I's iconic white-painted face was almost certainly killing her incrementally. Victorian children played with lead-painted toys, slept beneath lead-painted walls, and ate sweets wrapped in lead foil, and none of it was considered alarming until the science caught up. Public executions as family entertainment. In London, Tyburn Tree, a triangular wooden gallows capable of hanging 24 people simultaneously, was the site of public executions that drew crowds estimated in the tens of thousands, with vendors selling food, pamphlets, and programs listing the condemned and their crimes. Execution days were public holidays in many jurisdictions. with workers given the day off to attend on the principle that witnessing justice would deter future crime. Families brought children. People secured viewing spots on rooftops and in windows of nearby buildings, sometimes paying for the privilege. The heads of executed traitors were displayed on London Bridge for years afterward, sometimes preserved in tar to slow decomposition, and tourists and residents alike treated them as notable sights worth pointing out. In Paris during the Revolutionary Terror, the Place de la Révolution became a regular venue for guillotine executions that attracted crowds with a festival atmosphere. Tricoteuses, women who sat in the front rows knitting while watching the blade fall, became iconic enough to be memorialized in art and literature. The guillotine had been designed specifically to make execution more humane and egalitarian, yet the spectacle it created was arguably more normalized than anything before it. The last public execution in England took place on May 26, 1868, outside Newgate Prison, where Michael Barrett was hanged before a crowd estimated between 2,000 and 5,000. And the primary complaint from officials wasn't the crowd's presence, but its rowdiness. Grave robbing as a medical necessity. Until the Anatomy Act of 1832 in Britain, the only legal source of human bodies for medical dissection was executed murderers, a supply so small it was almost meaningless against the growing demand from expanding anatomy schools. The gap between supply and demand was filled by resurrection men, professional body snatchers who worked at night digging up fresh graves and selling the corpses to medical schools at prices equivalent to several weeks of an ordinary laborer's wages per body, somewhere in the range of 8 to 10 pounds per corpse by some accounts. Families of the recently deceased hired grave watchers constructed heavy iron cages called mort safes, bolted directly over burial sites, and commissioned specially designed stone slabs to deter digging. On some of these mort safes are still visible in Scottish churchyards today. The trade was organized and occasionally corrupt, with gangs reportedly bribing gravediggers and hospital staff for information on recent deaths. William Burke and William Hare took the logic of the trade to its endpoint. Rather than waiting for people to die and then digging them up, they murdered 16 people in Edinburgh in 1828 and sold the fresh bodies directly to anatomist Robert Knox, who asked no questions. The public outrage from the Burke and Hare case was substantial enough to finally move Parliament, and the Anatomy Act of 1832 resolved the supply problem by allowing unclaimed bodies from workhouses to be used for dissection, transferring the burden, with grim efficiency, from the recently buried to the destitute living. Child labor in truly horrifying conditions. Chimney sweep boys as young as 4 or 5 years old were sent up into narrow brick flues, sometimes still warm from recent fires, to scrape soot from the interior walls with their bare hands and small brushes, their bodies being the primary tool for a job that adult bodies physically couldn't perform. Masters who trained climbing boys sometimes lit small fires beneath reluctant children to encourage upward movement. The boys developed a distinctive occupational disease, scrotal cancer from chronic soot exposure, described by surgeon Percival Pott in 1775, in one of the earliest documented cases of an occupationally caused cancer in medical history. In textile mills, children called scavengers were employed to crawl beneath running machinery to collect loose cotton from the floor, machinery that did not stop while they were underneath it. In coal mines, children as young as 5 worked as trappers, sitting alone in complete darkness for 12 or more hours, operating ventilation doors, a role documented in the 1842 Children's Employment Commission report. Factory owners preferred children for these roles because their size, compliance, and low wages made them economically ideal, and orphan children from workhouses were transferred to factories under the legal fiction of apprenticeships that provided no meaningful training and no exit. The Factory Act of 1833 set a minimum working age of 9 for textile mills, considered a progressive reform at the time. Laudanum for everything, including babies. Laudanum, opium dissolved in alcohol, was sold over the counter at pharmacies across Britain and America throughout the 19th century. No prescription required, at prices low enough that even the poorest urban families could afford it. It was prescribed for menstrual cramps, coughs, diarrhea, anxiety, insomnia, teething pain, and what physicians broadly classified as nervousness, which covered almost any complaint a woman might present with. Products marketed specifically for infants included Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, which contained approximately 65 milligrams of morphine per fluid ounce according to later analyses, and Godfrey's cordial, a mixture of opium and treacle sold to parents to quiet crying babies. Mrs. Winslow's was nicknamed the baby killer by some physicians even as it remained commercially available and heavily advertised. The largest demographic of laudanum users in Victorian Britain was middle and upper-class women, prescribed the drug freely by physicians for almost any complaint. The era's epidemic of female hysteria and nervous disorders was, in substantial part, medically administered opium addiction. Notable users included Elizabeth Barrett Browning and Florence Nightingale, among many prominent figures who consumed it regularly for years. The Harrison Narcotics Tax Act of 1914 in the United States finally began regulating opiates, marking the end of an era in which a bottle of morphine syrup for your teething infant sat on the same pharmacy shelf as headache powder and cough drops. The wandering womb and medical treatments for women. Ancient Greek physicians, including Hippocrates, believed the uterus was a semi-autonomous organ capable of detaching from its position and migrating through the body, pressing against other organs and causing illness wherever it settled. Almost any physical or emotional complaint in a woman could be attributed to this wandering organ. The word hysteria derives directly from hystera, the Greek word for uterus, and the diagnosis it produced persisted in Western medicine in various forms for over 2,000 years. Treatment in the ancient world included holding strong-smelling substances near the patient's face to repel the uterus downward, while placing pleasant scents near the genitals to attract it back into position. Victorian-era physicians inherited this general framework in updated form. Hysteria became the most commonly diagnosed condition in 19th-century women, and treatments ranged from forced rest cures and institutionalization to surgical removal of healthy ovaries. Surgeon Robert Batty formalized the removal of healthy ovaries as a treatment for behavioral and emotional conditions in 1872, a procedure that became common enough to be called normal ovariotomy and was performed thousands of times on women whose primary complaint was that they were distressed, difficult, or simply inconvenient. The claim that Victorian physicians routinely induced orgasm as a medical treatment for hysteria, popularized by Rachel Maines in her book The Technology of Orgasm, is contested by historians Hallie Lieberman and Eric Schatzberg, who argue the evidence does not support the broad version of the claim. What is not contested is that hysteria as a diagnosis remained in use well into the 20th century, and its full removal from diagnostic frameworks took until 1980. If you want to see more, click the video on screen now.